The Tsar stands above his son, hands still trembling, eyes wide, not with rage, but with something deeper, something ancient, something animal. The staff he struck with is slick with blood at the tip, and below him, sprawled on the cold stone floor of the cathedral, is Ivan Ivanovich, his heir, his pride, his defiant mirror, bleeding from the skull, gasping, twitching. The silence is unbearable. It hums like a scream between generations. Ivan the Terrible has just done what no foreign army could. He has destroyed the future of his own dynasty with a single blow. He does not speak. His mouth opens, but only breath escapes. His eyes blink and blink again, as if time itself might reverse if he blinks hard enough. But the scene remains. The horror is real. The guards who witnessed it dare not move. Even the air in the cathedral holds its breath. Blood seeps between the tiles, bright, arterial, accusing. Ivan drops to his knees. He cradles the dying man in his arms like he once cradled him as an infant. But the son's face is slack now. His lips part, maybe to speak, maybe to forgive, maybe to curse. We will never know. The Tsar presses his hand to the wound, as if the pressure could erase it all, erase the years of suspicion, the months of anger, the seconds of violence. But the wound is too deep, and something more than a body is dying on that floor. The air was not perfect. He had challenged his father, defied him, argued. But he was the only one who could rule after Ivan, the only one who bore his father's fire without succumbing to madness. Fyodor, the younger son, was weak, pious, gentle, a lamb in a world of wolves. With Ivan Ivanovich, there was still a future. Now, the empire has no future, only ghosts. The blow didn't just kill a man, it cracked the bones of Russia's stability. And somewhere in the back of Ivan's fevered mind, he knew it. He had ruled through fear, through brutality, through divine right and the spectre of vengeance. But no prophecy had prepared him for this. No vision had warned him that the greatest threat to his kingdom was himself. And in that cathedral, where prayers once echoed and incense once drifted, there was now only the stench of blood and the slow, rattling breath of a dying crown. The Tsar wept. The people would never forget, and the dynasty would never recover. He was born into a palace of poison. In the winter of 1530, the air in the Kremlin hung heavy with incense and ash, a mixture of sacred ritual and quiet dread. The birth of Ivan IV was hailed with bells and prayers, but even then, especially then, the court knew what kind of world this child had entered. His father, Grand Prince Vasily III, ruled not through charisma or mercy, but through control, suspicion, and iron. His mother, Elena Glinskaya, was a woman of ambition and cunning, married more for power than love. The child they brought into the world was not born to be protected. He was born to be used, and the games began early. When Ivan was just 3, Vasily fell ill, sickened suddenly, violently. Some whispered it was God's punishment. Others blamed sorcery. But the truth didn't matter. The Grand Prince rotted from the inside out, his body failing, his mind unravelling, while the boy stood at the edge of the room, too young to understand the rot that had just been passed down to him. Vasily died, and the crown fell, silent and heavy, onto a child barely old enough to speak. Eleanor ruled in his place, or tried to. As regent, she was fierce, intelligent, a woman alone in a pit of wolves. She poisoned rivals, forged alliances, cloaked her son in ritual and ceremony. But behind the silk curtains of court, the knives were always out. When Ivan was 8, she too died, suddenly, painfully, perhaps by poison, and with her death the last thread of protection was cut. Ivan was now a crowned orphan, and the court turned on itself like starving dogs. Boyar families seized power. Rival clans warred behind closed doors. In the chambers of the Kremlin, Ivan watched as men fought for control of his future, while treating him like a relic on display. He ate scraps while they feasted. He wore rags while they dressed in sable. He was left to wander alone through freezing halls, stepping over corpses of servants who had displeased the wrong lord. In this world of betrayal and bruised ritual, Ivan learned what love looked like, absence, what loyalty meant, survival. He watched as the very people sworn to protect him, mocked him, neglected him, spat when he passed. And so the boy turned inward, and the hate began to boil. He began torturing animals, not out of cruelty at first, but curiosity. What would they do when they had no escape? What would they look like when the light left their eyes? He began asking the same about people. He started praying, but even God seemed silent. Only the rituals remained, the icons, the incense, the weight of prophecy, the knowledge that one day, one terrible, glorious day, he would rule. And when that day came, the child of war and ritual would not forget a single slight, not a single face, not a single moment he was made to feel small. Because Ivan did not become terrible. He was born in terror, baptized in it, and raised in its silence. All that remained was for the crown to fit. He did not play like other children. While princes elsewhere rode ponies and learned courtly manners, Ivan walked the echoing corridors of the Kremlin with dead eyes and dirt under his fingernails. The boy who would one day be Tsar spent his early years not surrounded by laughter or warmth, but by the smell of damp stone, rotting meat, and blood that never quite left the floor. He was alone, terribly, suffocatingly alone. The boyars ruled in his name, but treated him like a shadow, an inconvenient symbol they could not yet dispose of. They locked him in rooms for days, starved him of affection, beat his servants in front of him, and then made him thank them. They mocked his clothes, his voice, his tears. And still Ivan watched, and listened, and remembered. He found companionship in the only things that didn't talk back. Bones, birds he strangled with his hands, cats tossed from towers. He dissected them not as a scientist, but as a boy, desperate to understand what death felt like before he could give it. They say he pulled wings off beetles, that he would bury animals alive, only to dig them up days later, studying the decay. He was fascinated not by life, but by what remained when it left. And then one day he turned to humans. There are stories, whispers that even as a child he lured a beggar into the palace and watched him starve. That he pushed a servant down the stairs to see how long it took for the body to stop twitching. That he wandered through the crypts below the Kremlin, tracing the carved faces of long-dead princes, asking them questions no living soul would answer. This was no child king in waiting. This was a seed planted in cruelty and watered with contempt. But the rituals continued. They still called him Grand Prince, still paraded him on feast days, still kissed his small hands and murmured prayers for his soul, while behind him they planned his disappearance. His crown was a cage, a promise never meant to be kept. And then without warning, the boy struck back. At age 13, he ordered the arrest of Prince Andrei Shuisky, the man who had tormented him most. Ivan had him thrown to the hounds, not executed, torn apart, in front of the court, in front of God. No warning, no mercy, just a boy with sunken eyes watching his tormentor scream and bleed and disappear. The message was clear. The child was done playing with corpses. He was ready to start making them. The boy who played with corpses became a man who crowned himself a god. At 16, Ivan emerged from the shadows of the Kremlin like a storm breaking through the silence. No longer a boy, no longer someone else's pawn. In 1547, he demanded something no ruler before him had dared. Not Grand Prince, not heir, not steward. He would be crowned Tsar, not by tradition, but by divine right, a title rooted in Caesar, infused with the fire of Byzantium, and soaked in the blood of Eastern Empire. It wasn't just a title, it was a claim. He wasn't merely a ruler now, he was chosen, appointed by God, terrible in both power and righteousness. And Russia, still fractured and trembling, bowed. The coronation took place in the Cathedral of the Dormition, beneath golden domes that had witnessed centuries of ceremony, but never anything like this. Incense choked the air. Bells rang like thunder. The boy with hollow eyes walked through a crowd of nobles who had once tried to kill him, and now kissed the hem of his robe. They wept. He did not. They muttered prayers. He thought only of vengeance. With the crown placed on his head, Ivan became more than a man. He became a myth in motion. But for a time, he tried to be something else. There was fire inside him, yes, but also ambition, vision. He restructured the military, created new legal codes, built schools and libraries. For a flickering moment, it looked as if Ivan might become a just ruler. Feared, yes, but not yet monstrous. And then the fires returned. He married Anastasia Romanovna, a noble woman of quiet dignity and sharp intelligence. She softened him. Her presence calmed his demons. She spoke gently, even when his voice shook with fury. Under her influence, He showed mercy, built hospitals, spoke of love. But Ivan was not made for peace. Peace, to him, was silence before betrayal. Still, for 13 years, Anastasia stood beside him. The people came to believe that she was the only thing standing between the Tsar and the abyss, and Ivan, in his own twisted way, loved her. Perhaps the only person he ever truly did, which is why her death shattered everything. She fell ill in 1560. Quickly, violently, her skin went pale, her breath turned sour. Ivan stayed beside her bed for days, refusing to eat, refusing to pray. When she died, something inside him tore open and never closed again. He blamed the boyars, accused them of poisoning her. Whether it was true didn't matter. To Ivan, the only truth was the ache in his chest and the poison in his thoughts. From that day on, the man who had crowned himself Tsar ceased trying to rule like a king. He would rule like a god, and gods do not ask, they command. Before the rot fully took hold, there was a light in Ivan's life. Small, steady and human, her name was Anastasia Romanovna, and in a palace thick with whispers and betrayal, she was the one voice that did not tremble. They met not in the heat of conquest or the artifice of diplomacy, but through the strange and brutal tradition of the bride show, a pageant of eligible women paraded before the Tsar like livestock. Ivan was expected to choose a womb, a face, a name that would make sense for alliances. Instead, he chose her. She was not the most beautiful, not the most politically useful, but there was something in her silence, in the way she did not perform for him, that pierced his armour. She did not fear him, and in that fearlessness, he found a kind of peace. She became Tsarina in 1547, the first ever to wear the title. But more than that, she became the quiet rhythm beneath his chaos. When his temper boiled, she soothed it. When the boyars schemed, she tempered his revenge. She gave him sons, yes, but more than that, she gave him the illusion of being whole. To the court, she was a ghost, gentle, distant, obedient. To Ivan, she was the anchor to whatever fragments of his soul still clung to sanity. And in that fragile tether, Russia found its closest thing to peace. For a time, he governed with reason. He opened foreign relations. He listened to advisors. He rebuilt Moscow after a devastating fire. He rode to war, yes, but with purpose, not obsession. Behind his eyes there was still fire, but it flickered rather than consumed. The terrible boy had grown into a dangerous man, but not yet a mad one. And then her body began to fail. It began with headaches, then fevers, then vomiting, seizures, confusion. Her skin lost colour, her hair thinned. The court physicians had no answers, and Ivan became convinced it was not illness, but murder, poison, treachery. Someone had taken from him the only soft thing he had ever known. He sat at her bedside for days, clutching her hand, begging her not to leave. But there was no healing her. She died in 1560, and with her death, the final dam burst. Ivan tore through the court like a wild animal. Accusations, executions, torture. Boyars were flayed, boiled, strangled with their own robes. Even those who had served him loyally were not spared. He needed someone to blame, because if no one had poisoned her, then the world itself had simply robbed him, and that was unbearable. In private, he kept her belongings near, her hair, her letters. Some say he slept beside her preserved corpse for days. Others say he ordered it exhumed years later, just to look at her face. Whatever the truth, this is what mattered. The only light he had ever known had gone out, and in its place the dark began to bloom. After Anastasia's death, Ivan no longer walked through the Kremlin. He prowled it. His steps were erratic, his eyes sunken, rimmed with crimson from sleepless nights and the weeping he would never admit to. Those close to him said he spoke aloud to her ghost, that he'd stop mid-sentence, stare into nothing, and whisper her name. But the grief did not soften him. It curdled. It metastasized into something far more dangerous. He became obsessed with the idea that she had been murdered, poisoned slowly and with precision by those who envied her influence over him. And once the idea took root, it became truth, undeniable, unshakable. Ivan had always believed betrayal was inevitable. Now he believed it was personal. He began testing his food obsessively, forced servants to taste it first, executed entire kitchens for a stomachache. He accused his closest advisors of plotting his death in the shadows of chapel walls. Anyone who had spoken kindly to Anastasia became suspect. Anyone who had not spoken kindly to her became worse. Poison was no longer a fear. It was a language, a logic, a system that explained the chaos in his mind. And so he poisoned back. Records say he employed herbalists and alchemists, not to heal, but to experiment, to concoct. His enemies didn't just vanish, they died horribly, with purpled veins and bleeding mouths, with rotting intestines and twisted limbs. Ivan wanted them to feel what she had felt, if indeed she had been poisoned at all, because beneath it all, there was still that tiny voice, buried deep. What if no one had killed her? What if she had just died? But Ivan couldn't accept that, because if death was random, then he was powerless. And if he was powerless, then everything, the rituals, the coronation, the terror, meant nothing. So he doubled down, tripled. Fear became his theology. He created the Oprichnina, his black-robed secret police. They swept through Russia like a plague, armed with axes and boundless authority, dressed in black with dog heads stitched to their saddles to sniff out traitors. They became the living embodiment of his paranoia. Cities were emptied, monasteries were torched, entire noble families erased. The Tsar no longer trusted his friends, so he replaced them with executioners. And still he mourned. He remarried, many times, but none of them were Anastasia. Some he forced into marriage, some he beat, others he discarded or killed. They were vessels, placeholders, attempts to conjure what was already lost. Each night he saw ghosts, each morning he hunted the living, and through it all, the question whispered behind every scream, every pyre, every shattered skull: had he lost her to treachery, or simply to time? Ivan never found the answer, but he made sure the world bled for it. They rode like demons through the snow, dressed in black from head to toe, their saddles adorned with rotting dog heads and broomsticks, symbols of their sacred duty to sniff out treason and sweep it clean from the land. They were not soldiers, not nobles, not men bound by honour or law. They were oprichniki, Ivan's personal executioners, and the living embodiment of his madness. He did not invent them out of strategy. He birthed them out of grief. After Anastasia's death, Ivan no longer believed in loyalty, only performance. He no longer trusted bloodlines or oaths, only fear. The boyars had raised him like a prisoner, and in his eyes, killed the only person he had ever loved. He would not let them rule again. And so he built a second Russia inside the first, a shadow kingdom of terror, where only the Tsar's will mattered. The Oprichnina was the name given to this dark mirror state, a swath of land carved out from the rest of the empire, where Ivan reigned alone, untouched by council or court. And the Oprichniki were its priests. Their initiation was theatrical, religious, grotesque. They renounced all family ties, all moral codes, but Ivan's. They would kneel before him and swear oaths of absolute devotion, while the Tsar, dressed in monk's robes, anointed them not with holy oil, but with blood. These men became shadows in service of a god. They carried out purges, arrests, tortures with ritualistic zeal, and Ivan loved them for it. They roamed the streets of Moscow at night, dragging suspected traitors from their beds, flaying their skin, boiling them alive, impaling them on stakes as warnings. Whole families were wiped out based on whispers, monasteries burned, babies smashed against walls. Even the dead were exhumed and desecrated, because loyalty, in Ivan's world, extended beyond the grave. And always he watched, sometimes from afar, sometimes through a slit in a church wall, other times seated among the Oprichniki as they dined on black bread and laughter after a night of slaughter. Ivan would play his lute and compose chants, pretending the screams outside were nothing more than wind. The Oprichniki were not just executioners, they were a performance, a statement, proof that Russia belonged to the Tsar not because of lineage or tradition, but because he had reshaped its very soul. And the people feared them more than death. Even the boyars who survived learned to grovel, to perform penance in sackcloth and ashes, kissing the boots of the men who had murdered their kin. Resistance was not punished, it was erased, but Ivan did not stop. He could not stop. The terror had momentum now, a logic of its own. The more he killed, the more betrayal he imagined. The more he imagined, the more he believed, until even the Oprichniki, once sacred in his eyes, began to look suspicious. So he turned on them too. He dissolved the order after years of bloodletting, burned their fortresses, executed their leaders, scattered the survivors. The instruments of his vengeance had served their purpose, and in the silence that followed, all that remained was the Tsar, the ghosts he had made, and the crown that grew heavier by the hour. They were born beneath the shadow of a man who thought himself a god, and in that shadow they never stood a chance. Ivan had children, yes, but he did not raise sons, he forged successors, and like everything forged in fire, they came out twisted, brittle, and ready to break. His firstborn, Ivan Ivanovich, was not simply the heir to a throne. He was the mirror Ivan could not bear to look into, a boy moulded not with tenderness, but with fear, watched constantly, judged endlessly, and praised only when he mimicked his father's cold precision. From an early age the boy understood the rules. Speak when spoken to, never show weakness, and always make your father proud, or at least less angry. He learned diplomacy beside corpses, war beside trembling generals, religion beside priests too afraid to correct him, and he learned love in the absence of it, because Ivan the Terrible did not father his children. He dominated them. If the boy cried, he was beaten. If he succeeded, the Tsar would sneer and remind him that his triumph was nothing without permission. When the boy married, Ivan intervened. When he showed ambition, Ivan grew suspicious. Every step forward was met with a slap. Every word of independence, a threat. And still, Ivan Ivanovich tried, because there was something inside him that burned to be more. Not another tyrant, not another puppet of paranoia, but a ruler in his own right. He sought knowledge, he argued policy, he challenged decisions, and when his father dismissed the court with raving decrees, Ivan dared to question him. It was not defiance, it was desperation. The son wanted a future, the father saw only betrayal. Meanwhile, Ivan's younger son, Fyodor, drifted in the opposite direction. Quiet, fragile, and deeply pious, Fyodor retreated from the world. He prayed more than he spoke. He smiled nervously at violence, and when his father erupted in rage, Fyodor would simply bow his head and wait for the storm to pass. Ivan had no respect for him, called him soft, useless, a monk in a prince's robes, and yet the irony lingered like incense in a ruined church. The son Ivan despised would inherit the throne. The son he feared would never wear the crown at all. But not yet. Not yet. Because even as Ivan aged, even as his body failed and his hands trembled, he clung to power like a drowning man to a stone. He would not abdicate. He would not share. The throne was his. Russia was his. His sons were only guests in a world he had built, and they would stay in their place or suffer the consequences, and so they did. Until one day, one argument, one breath too close to the fire, would shatter the dynasty. There was no crown more cursed than the one Ivan's sons were meant to wear, and none more haunted by the man who forged it. Ivan Ivanovich, the firstborn, carried the full weight of that inheritance, not just the expectation of rule, but the suffocating legacy of a father who could never let go. As the Tsar aged and paranoia gave way to physical decay, Ivan Ivanovich found himself stepping into the role more often, representing his father at councils, commanding troops, holding court in his absence, and for a time he was good at it. Too good. He was sharp, decisive, respected by the nobility, and even feared on the battlefield. But every success became another nail in his coffin, because Ivan the Terrible didn't want a capable son. He wanted an obedient extension of himself, one who would bow even when the empire crumbled beneath them, one who would never outshine the father's myth. And Ivan Ivanovich could not, would not, dim his fire to satisfy a broken man. Their arguments grew louder, their confrontations more public. Advisors watched them from a distance, like men caught between two storms, not knowing which would strike first. And then came the final a moment so small, so intimate, so brutal in its consequences. The young Tsarevich's wife, recently pregnant, was seen by Ivan the Terrible, wearing clothes he deemed immodest, too light, too revealing, a threat to the moral decay of the court, at least in his mind. He flew into a rage, beating the pregnant girl until her body collapsed and her womb gave way. She lost the child. When Ivan Ivanovich discovered what had happened, he did what no one else dared. He screamed back. In the halls of the palace, he confronted his father, demanding to know how a ruler of God could murder his own future, demanding to know what justice meant when it did not protect blood, what piety was worth when it came soaked in the screams of women and unborn children. And Ivan, with his old hands trembling, struck. He lifted his iron staff and drove it into his son's skull. There was no hesitation, only rage. The blow did not kill him immediately. Ivan Ivanovich fell, bleeding, sobbing, not from pain, but from disbelief. His father had destroyed everything, the lineage, the hope, the bond. And in the seconds that followed, the Tsar knelt beside his dying son and howled. Witnesses said he cradled the boy's shattered head, that he begged for forgiveness, weeping into the pool of blood, his robes soaking it up like in ink into parchment. He cried not for the loss of a son, but for what it meant, that he had become death itself, even to those who once loved him. Ivan Ivanovich lingered for hours, maybe days. He drifted in and out of consciousness, until at last the life slipped from him. The heir was gone, and the throne now belonged to Fyodor, the quiet, broken one, the son Ivan had always ignored, who now watched his father from the shadows with eyes emptied by trauma. Russia too had begun to empty. Cities bled out, the treasury faltered, the court trembled in silence, and through it all the Tsar aged, howling into the void, surrounded by ghosts he had made with his own hands. The crown would live on, but it would sit on a head bowed not with pride, but with the weight of nightmare. The light inside the cathedral slanted through the stained glass like fractured fire, casting blood-red halos on stone walls that had heard too many prayers and buried too many screams. Ivan stood beneath the high dome, shrouded in shadow, his breath ragged and sour. This was not a place of peace for him, not anymore. It was a cage of echoes. Every step he took across the marble floor seemed to awaken voices. Anastasia's laughter, the whisper of his son's dying breath, the hush of traitors long since executed. The walls knew everything, and still they stood. He came to the cathedral now, not to seek God, but to wrestle him. His prayers had turned into argument. His fasting had turned into fury. He would clutch the icons, knuckles white with rage, demanding to know why a man, so divinely crowned, had been cursed to bury his own child. Why he, the anointed ruler of all Rus, had been abandoned by heaven and left to rot in a palace of ghosts. Sometimes he threw himself at the floor, begging. Other times he screamed until the monks outside trembled. But more often he just stared, at the crucifix, at the icon of Christ Pantocrator, as if daring the divine to speak. No answer came, only memory. He remembered the days when his son knelt beside him in this very space, imitating every move, crossing himself with solemnity, whispering the liturgy with the awkward rhythm of a boy trying to become a man. Ivan had once taken pride in that, had once imagined the two of them side by side, father and heir, two holy Tsars forging a future out of divine fire. But the vision had been shattered by his own hand. Now there was only silence. The cathedral was not empty, though. Servants lingered at the doors, terrified to interrupt him. A priest stood by the altar, motionless, as if any sound might ignite the Tsar's fury. Ivan turned to him, eyes wild, beard unkempt, and whispered, "Do you know what I've done?" The priest didn't answer. Couldn't. Ivan stepped closer, trembling. He was the future, and I crushed it. I was God's hand, and now, what am I now? The priest made the sign of the cross, lips quivering. Ivan slapped him so hard, the man fell sideways into a column. Then silence returned, total and deafening. The Tsar collapsed before the altar and wept, not like a father, not like a king, but like a creature that had torn its own heart out and couldn't remember why. Outside, the Kremlin bells tolled for no one. The snow began to fall, covering the blood-stained stones, as if the land itself was trying to forget. But nothing forgotten ever truly stays buried. And the rage Ivan left in that cathedral would find new targets, because when a tyrant loses the only person he feared disappointing, there is no one left to restrain the monster he always was. They said the sound echoed across the stone corridors, like the tolling of some ancient cursed bell. Not the scream of a man in pain, but something deeper, animal, cosmic, guttural, a scream that cracked the world open. Ivan clutched his son's lifeless body, as if he could will it back to warmth. His hands, still stained with drying blood, trembled against the broken crown of the boy's skull. One eye was already glazed, the breath was gone, and in that hollow silence, Ivan did the only thing left that a god king could do. He screamed. Not just once, again and again, as if he were trying to exorcise the grief from his lungs or punish the walls for having witnessed it. Guards outside froze. Servants fell to their knees, too afraid to move, too terrified to listen. The scream was pain, yes, but not only. It was the sound of a man watching his legacy dissolve into a puddle of blood at his feet. For years, Ivan had believed himself invincible. The hand of God, the terror of empires. He had buried wives, slaughtered nobles, burned villages. He had carved a kingdom from fire and ice and ruled with the certainty of prophecy. But now, in a single moment of fury, he had destroyed the one soul who had ever tried to love him without fear. He rocked the body, muttering through choked sobs. Apologies, confessions, prayers that turned into curses, and back again. His mind splintered in real time. The man who had orchestrated purges and executions with surgical cruelty now babbled like a lost child, searching the boy's face for signs of life, whispering childhood memories, bargaining with saints he hadn't believed in for decades. No, 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 no. Wake up, my son, forgive me. I didn't mean... He tried to press the wound closed with his bare hands, as if he could contain what he had unleashed. But the blood would not stop. It soaked into the floor, into his robes, into history itself. That night, Ivan did not sleep. He didn't eat. He didn't speak. He sat beside the corpse, stroking his son's hair, whispering old lullabies from a time when the world was smaller, and Anastasia still lived, and he still believed himself human. When dawn broke, the guards entered, cautious, heads bowed. Ivan looked up at them with eyes they would never forget. Not wrathful, not regal, just hollow. They say he ordered the body to be washed, clothed and entombed with the reverence of a martyr, not a prince, a saint. Because in that moment Ivan understood too late. His son had been the only part of him that was not monstrous, and now he was gone. The scream would fade from the halls, but not from memory. The court grew colder, the Kremlin darker, the Tsar more erratic, more haunted, because the terrible truth had settled into his bones. He had ruled through terror, conquered through cruelty, but he could not undo a single moment of rage. The father who had struck down his own flesh had screamed not for forgiveness, but because somewhere deep inside, a sliver of him still remembered how to feel. The air inside the Kremlin changed after the Tsarevich's death. It wasn't just quieter, it was heavier, as if the palace itself had inhaled the scream and chosen never to exhale. Candles burned lower, curtains stayed drawn. No music, no laughter, just footsteps echoing in halls where no one dared speak of the thing that had happened. But everyone knew. Russia did not pause to mourn, it simply recoiled, because when a tyrant kills his heir, it sends more than grief through a kingdom. It sends a message. If blood means nothing, then no one is safe. And so the boyars bowed deeper, spoke softer. The church prayed louder. The people waited in fear. Ivan, once volatile, became something worse, predictable in his unpredictability. He no longer erupted, he withered. The man who had once ridden into towns, cloaked in black fury, now shuffled like a spectre through his own court, muttering to no one, smiling at shadows. He still issued decrees, hundreds of them, but many were nonsense. He demanded new palaces and forgot they existed. He appointed generals and then accused them of treason hours later. His mind had not broken all at once, but cracked, and through the cracks poured every ghost he'd ever made. Fyodor, now the only surviving son, remained a fixture just outside the frame, present, but never truly seen. He was meek, more monk than monarch, content to fade into candlelight and psalm. Ivan did not groom him for power. He barely acknowledged him. It was as if the crown no longer mattered, not because Ivan had transcended it, but because he had polluted it beyond repair. The court fractured. Factions bloomed like rot beneath stone. Men whispered in corners, jostling for position in the inevitable collapse. Who would rule after Ivan? Fyodor had no spine. The dynasty had no future. And behind every curtain, someone waited. Nobles, regents, false heirs, each sharpening their knives, counting down the hours. Outside the walls, Russia trembled. The people had endured famine, war, plague, but this was different. This was the spiritual collapse of a kingdom. A father killing a son was a private grief in most households. But when the father is Tsar, the wound infects the nation. Villages lit candles in secret for the dead air. Some whispered prayers to him, as if he were a martyr. Others cursed him for not surviving. The Orthodox Church tread carefully, too terrified to call the boy a saint, too ashamed to leave him in silence. And all the while, Ivan continued, breathing, walking, issuing mad proclamations. A dead man with a crown. Russia had become a kingdom in limbo, its ruler haunted by his own sin, its heir buried beneath icon and incense, and its people drifting further into dread. But the blow had done more than take a life. It had broken the mechanism that held the empire together, and the cracks were only just beginning to spread. In the years that followed, Russia did not collapse. It unravelled, quietly, slowly, like frost crawling across a window pane, distorting everything behind it. The Tsar still sat on his throne, but the throne no longer ruled. It brooded. Ivan's authority no longer surged from strength or awe, but from the dead weight of fear and ritual. People obeyed, not because they believed, but because belief had rotted and been replaced by survival. Fyodor, the only living son, drifted through the halls like a ghost, too timid to haunt. He was crowned in ceremony, dressed in silk, surrounded by gold, but beneath it all was ash. He was not bred to rule, not trained, not capable, and Ivan knew it. That was the cruelest irony of all. The son he killed had been a mirror of his younger self, proud, fiery, dangerous in his certainty. The son who remained was a whisper of a man, frightened of shadows, more at home in prayer than policy. It was like a joke carved into the bones of empire. The boyars, those wary aristocrats who had learned to bend under Ivan's storm, began preparing for the future they dared not name. They built alliances, fostered rival claimants, aligned with ambitious generals. Ivan saw it all, but he no longer had the energy to destroy them. His fury was now intermittent, like the dying breath of a furnace. He raged, not like a god, but like an old man, remembering what godhood once felt like. And beyond the Kremlin, the world moved on. Enemies circled. The borders of Russia were stretched thin, torn between expansionist ambition and internal decay. The wars that Ivan had once led with fanatical determination now dragged on in his absence, commanded by lesser men with lesser visions. The treasury dwindled, famine returned, peasants spoke in hushed tones of omens, of a land cursed by blood, ruled by a man who had murdered his own legacy. Inside the churches the bells still rang, the liturgy continued, but even the icons seemed darker, the incense heavier. The priests bowed before Ivan, but their prayers turned inward. They asked for peace, for mercy, for an end that might not damn them all. And then, one day, Ivan simply collapsed. In the middle of a game of chess, they said. His fingers froze around a piece, his mouth slackened, and he fell. No cry, no scream, just the slow, crumpled descent of a man whose soul had been eroding since the moment his staff cracked his son's skull. Some said it was a stroke, others poison, but all agreed on one thing. He did not die alone. Not truly, because when his body was dragged from the floor, the blood of his son was still clinging to his name, his crown, his throne. Russia inherited not a dynasty, but a vacuum, and into that void would pour chaos, pretenders, wars, a time so dark it would be remembered only as the time of troubles. The blow that killed the Tsarevich had not just shattered a family, it had broken the spine of a nation, and Russia would spend generations learning how to stand again. There was no thunder when Ivan died, no omen, no divine reckoning, just the quiet collapse of a man who had been decaying long before his final breath. It happened, they said, during a game of chess. The Tsar leaned forward, hand trembling as he reached for a piece, and then nothing. He slid to the floor like melting wax. No scream, no last command, just a sigh, half caught in his throat, and a silence that wrapped around the room like a noose. The servants didn't rush. They watched, afraid that even in death he might rise again, might strike, might roar. One of them approached, hesitant, and touched his hand, cold, the fingers curled like claws. His face, once feared across continents, now hung slack and open-mouthed, as if even his corpse was still trying to speak. But he had said enough. They wrapped his body in silence, not reverence. The bells rang, not in mourning, but out of obligation. The court moved like a funeral procession that had rehearsed for years, because everyone had known this was coming. They just didn't know what would come next. He was laid out in state, robed in gold, surrounded by icons and incense, the ceremony thick with irony. Priests read prayers over the man who had once made saints tremble. Boyars stood at attention, some with tears, most with calculation. And in the back of the chamber, Fyodor, his only living son, watched with blank eyes, the weight of the crown descending like a shroud over a man who had never asked for it. There was no grand outpouring of grief. The people remembered too well. They remembered the purges, the mass graves, the black-cloaked riders, the Tsar who had ruled not through love, but terror. They remembered how his rage had turned Russia into a crucible, how he had built his power on screams and ashes. But death is strange. Even monsters, when dead, begin to shift in the memory. The man who had butchered his own heir was now spoken of as tragic, complex, a father too burdened by destiny, a ruler too devoted to God. The myth-making began before the earth had even settled over his grave, and yet the truth remained. Ivan IV died not as the first Tsar of Russia, not as a holy ruler, not even as a man. He died as a husk, a hollow, haunted body that had once held the storm. A man who had outlived love, sanity and legacy. A father who had destroyed his own blood. And a tyrant whose death, though long awaited, left behind not peace, but a silence filled with everything he had broken. Because the terror he had carved into Russia didn't die with him. It lived on, in the cracked throne, in the frightened eyes of his heir, and in a kingdom about to fall into chaos. The tyrant was dead, but his shadow remained. They say in that final moment, just before the blow landed, just before bones split and blood spilled, Ivan saw something in his son's eyes that stopped him for just a second. Long enough to remember, long enough to regret. It wasn't fear. His son had learned to mask fear long ago, just as he had learned to speak softly to a father who growled like a god. No, what Ivan saw wasn't fear. It was disbelief, not horror at death, but betrayal. A question written so plainly across the boy's face that it burned through the Tsar's fury. How could you? And for a heartbeat, Ivan was not a Tsar, not a tyrant, not the hand of divine vengeance. He was just a father who had once held this child wrapped in linen, who had whispered lullabies in candlelight, who had looked into those same eyes when they were still wide with wonder, and not dulled by politics or survival. But the moment passed, the staff fell, and when the body crumpled, that question stayed frozen in the boy's gaze, unblinking, unanswered. What did Ivan see in those eyes? He saw the cost, the echo of Anastasia's voice, silenced long ago. He saw what might have been, a legacy built not from fire and terror, but from wisdom and continuity. He saw the one person in the world who still tried to love him, not because of the crown, but despite it. And he saw that love being extinguished by his own hand. That look would haunt him, more than the blood, more than the silence that followed. In that split second, Ivan had recognized something he had spent a lifetime crushing in himself. Vulnerability, mercy, hope. And when it reflected back at him from his son, it enraged him. Not because it was weakness, but because it was gone from him. He had killed what he had long lost, and in doing so, he proved that it had ever existed. There were nights afterward, cold, long nights, when he would sit alone in his chambers, the candlelight trembling around him, and mutter fragments of apology to no one, to his son, to the God he believed had abandoned him, to the ghost in the room that refused to leave. He didn't just see death in his son's eyes, he saw himself, stripped of titles, stripped of myth, just a man, alone, ruined. And that more than anything is why Ivan the Terrible was never the same, because there is no cruelty greater than recognizing your own humanity only after you've destroyed the last person who mirrored it. He wore 3 crowns, though only one was forged in gold. The first they gave him when he was a child, woven with ritual and destiny, pressed onto his young brow by trembling hands. The second he carved for himself, tempered in fear, built from executions and blood, and wielded like a cudgel across a terrified nation. The third he never asked for, the crown of a father, the crown that weighed heaviest. Ivan the Terrible was all 3 things, and none of them. Tsar, tyrant, father, a triangle of selves, each tearing at the others until the shape collapsed. He ruled with fire because that's how he was raised, abandoned, beaten, humiliated. He believed cruelty was clarity, that a whip spoke truth, that love was weakness dressed in betrayal's clothing. And yet he loved. He loved his first wife, Anastasia, more than he could bear. Her presence softened something inside him, reminded him of the boy he used to be, before the dungeons, before the whispers, before the crown. When she died, poisoned or not, that boy died too. What replaced him was not just a ruler, it was a wound that walked. He loved his son, the one with his eyes and fire, the heir he raised to be sharp, loyal, unflinching. But what he never understood was that raising a mirror does not mean liking what you see. And the son looked back, not with submission, but with judgment. The same judgment that had haunted Ivan all his life. That of God, that of history, that of a conscience he tried to bury but never fully killed. So when the staff fell, when the blood pooled, it wasn't just a murder. It was an execution of hope, a war between the tyrant and the father, and the tyrant won. But victory turned to rot in his mouth. For the rest of his days, Ivan wore the title of Tsar, but it meant less than nothing. He sat on a throne made of dust, beside a crown that no longer fit, inside a palace haunted by the scream of a dying boy. He issued decrees, led campaigns, crushed rebellion, but he never outran that moment, never outran the flash of his son's eyes just before the blow. He tried to rewrite it, said it was an accident, a misunderstanding, a divine punishment, but even Ivan knew that history wouldn't save him. Not from that, not from the silence left in his halls, not from the name he had given himself and could never escape. They called him terrible, but that wasn't the truth. The truth was that he was all things at once, the Tsar who unified Russia, the tyrant who drowned it in fear, and the father who, in a single act of rage, shattered both. And when the bells finally tolled for him, there was no clear eulogy, no single legacy, just 3 crowns, one on his head, one in his shadow, and one buried with the boy he could never bring back. If this story shook you, if the tragedy of a father, a tyrant, and a shattered legacy made you see history in a darker light, then give this video a like. And if you want more stories that history tried to bury, make sure to subscribe. There's so much more they never told you.